Have you ever seen the aftermath of a fire that wasn't supposed to happen? The smoke, the ash that sits on the ground, and then there's like this eerie silence of something that was supposed to be beautiful that just is all of a sudden not there anymore. One spark can consume something in minutes, and all of a sudden something that was supposed to be beautiful is gone. And James 3 reminds us that our words can be just like that one spark. That in a moment, we can hurt relationships, we can hurt people, we can scorch trust, and we can do a lot of damage with the words that we say in just one singular moment. A careless word, a selfish decision, or some form of jealousy can take out something beautiful in just a moment. And I know this because I've seen it firsthand. And within the church, this can happen so fast. When I was in high school, our church announced that they wanted to repaint our church foyer, which doesn't seem like a big decision until you walked through our church foyer and realized that there was a mural on the wall that was painted by a church member that was no longer with us. And that mural held sentimental value for a lot of people within the church. And I can tell you, I didn't have a big idea of either side. I was in high school at the time, and neither side really meant a whole lot to me. But I do remember the way that people talked to each other in the middle of that season. I remember the hate, and I remember the anger, and I remember the terrible things that people said to each other simply because they were on one side of painting the foyer or on the side of preserving the mural. And I remember the people that left our church over the hateful comments that people made. I remember the people that their relationship with Jesus was changed for years to come because there were people within the church that acted so hatefully. And I'm not arguing for one side or the other, but both sides had things to say. And James 3 paints this picture so vividly. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. And that damage doesn't just stop with us. It goes beyond us sometimes. Last week we talked about our words and the way that they affect us and other people around us. But I want you to consider for just a moment the way that your words might influence people in the church, in your community, and outside of just yourself. Because it doesn't stay in just one moment. Often, the words that we say, the things that we have, the hatred that we harbor, it spreads. It goes about our communities, and like a forest set on fire by a single spark, our divisions often start really small. Sometimes they're a disagreement, a jealous comment, or a grudge held for a really long time. And then things spread. And they get out of hand really quickly. That kind of scorched earth goes further than just us. It damages people sometimes for generations who walk away from Jesus altogether. And James writes to this church that has seen the effects of what it looks like when people use their unkind words and leave scorched earth in their wake. And so like any good pastor, he doesn't want to just deal with the words. He wants to go a little bit deeper. And so in today's passage, we'll find James asking us questions like, what's underneath all of this? And where is there wisdom fueling our lives? And what kind of fire are we spreading? Is it the fire of our faith, or is it the fire of selfishness and ambition? But then I also want you to consider one more question. What small spark might you be carrying with you, even right now? And James asks us to consider the source of all of these sparks. And his answer to all of it is wisdom. So last week, Pastor Nan shared with you that we should be careful about our words and the ways that they interact with the people so close to us. But I want you to think about this as we consider our scripture for today. That James argues that we should be careful with our words and the ways that we interact with other people, because the ways that we interact with people go beyond us. They show the type of wisdom that we have as Christ followers. And James calls each of us to share in the responsibility of living as peacemakers who share the good news of Christ wherever we go. And so this passage that we're going to read here in just a moment from James 3 might not be groundbreaking to you. It might not come at you with some sort of shock or surprise, but today I want to invite you to think of how you might live your everyday life, the small moments that you go through, the conversations that you have, as a Christian who cares about humility and peacemaking in all of your relationships. And so with that, I would invite you to stand as we read James 3:13-18 together. It says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but it's earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. For when you have envy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness." This is the word of the Lord. I thank you all that when I read this passage, and I started out with a question, who is wise and understanding among you, that I didn't get people jumping up and down answering, me, me, me. So I'm the youth pastor here, and sometimes our teenagers like to talk back to me when I'm up on the platform. So if I asked a bunch of middle schoolers who was wise, I promise you they would answer that question, but thank you guys for not jumping out of your seat. I don't think that James would have needed to ask his readers, who is wise among you? In James's day, the wise people would have been absolutely loud and made themselves known on every street corner. They would have never spent time quietly reflecting on anything. They would have taken their position as a wise cornerstone of the community loudly and made it known to everyone who would listen that they hold the title of wise because they have something to say. And James, entirely against this culture, says that those who are wise should not be the loudest in the room, that they should do two things. And the first thing he says is that people with wisdom should show it by their good works, and then people with wisdom should show it with their humility. Now, I don't think that we often see a lot of people in our culture today living off of those two things. If people assume that they have something to say, they do still get really loud and share their opinion for anyone and everyone to hear in person and on the internet, right? This is not hard to see in our modern day. But what James does is flips the narrative. He says, yeah, you can be really loud, but the people with true wisdom, if you think that you have true wisdom, you should show it with the way that you live and with your humility. Now, James goes back to connect what he says about good works in this passage. It's a callback for us to realize that good works not only come through faith, but also they should be a characteristic of wisdom. James established that faith and works are connected, but those who have heavenly wisdom should be able to show their wisdom with the way that they live out their lives as well. It should be practical and not just words that you have marked in your life. Godly wisdom produces good works, and it doesn't even need to boast with words. But the other thing that James tells us to have is humility. And people with godly wisdom should also have humility. One marker of that humility for us biblically is that we realize that when we are cared for by our loving Savior, we are not in a position any different than the people next to us. And here's what I mean by that. That even though I'm up here on the platform this morning talking to you and sharing the word with you, God loves me just the same as he loves you. And God loves the person sitting next to you just the same as he loves you. Because we are all in need of the same grace. And so when we live our lives in humility, we realize that we're not any more special than anyone else around the world. But God gives us all the same kind of grace. There's another side of humility, though, that I want us to look at. And I brought a Thomas Merton quote for you. He says that humility consists in being in the presence of others precisely the person that you are in the presence of God. And I think this quote gets at the heart of what James has to say for the rest of the passage. That if we are to be Christians who live in the wisdom of God, that we should live out our faith in season and out of season. That wherever we go and whoever we see, wherever we are, and whoever we're interacting with, we should be the same person that we are in the presence of God. And that we should carry the same kind of wisdom and care into every relationship. So James goes on to tell us about two different kinds of wisdom. And the first is earthly wisdom. And there's a lot of people that have earthly wisdom, but this wisdom is marked by selfish ambition and pride, and also envy. We find out that selfish ambition in this time would have meant a self-seeking pursuit of political office by unfair means. Now, I'm looking around here, and I don't think that many of you have run for political office, and if you have, I hope that it hasn't been by unfair means. So it might sound a little bit out of touch that James is saying that we should not live our lives by our own selfish ambition. But when people in the church use their leadership positions, or any position, to have their influence to create division, there's a problem. And James is speaking to a church that knows this all too well. There were people in this time that were intentionally trying to come into churches to be loud, to specifically create division within the church. They were trying to come in and boost their own ego and care for themselves and push their own agendas and be loud. And James is saying this is not the wisdom of God. We also find as we recall in James, that people were mistreating the poor and caring only for those who were rich in the church. And so anytime that we find a Christian who continues to act out of the prejudices of their society, we realize that they're not acting with God's viewpoint or with godly wisdom. And James is really concerned about the church caring for one another well. And so even though James says earthly wisdom might be loud, and it might be clever, and it might sound interesting sometimes, it's not holy. And he's really concerned about a church that would be divided on what is holy wisdom and what is earthly wisdom. And so he even says this, that it leads to disorder and every evil practice, which when I first read through the text, I thought that sounds kind of mean, because I know some really nice people that don't know the Lord, right? And so I thought maybe that sounds a little bit mean. But here's what James means. That word disorder is also in chapter 1 and chapter 3 that describes double-mindedness. That we cannot have the wisdom of God and also be guided by the wisdom of the world. It just does not make sense to be both humble and boastful, to be gentle and manipulative, and to be pure and power-hungry. And the church has to be very, very, very careful that we are not guided by our own selves. A little bit more about the context of where James is talking to. The people in James's time, sometimes there were people who were coming into the church who were dividing up the church and telling people, you can come follow me instead of following after the teachings of the church. And they were coming in trying to divide relationships and split people and telling people to follow them, creating unnecessary conflict, and just starting this party spirit of us versus them, that there must be a better way to follow Christ, and nobody else gets it. So if we get in our little holy huddle, then we must be better than everyone else. And James is saying that is not the way of God. That is the way of pride. And so there were people just trying to build up their own selves. But our actions and our words are always watched by others. And the wise know that it's not about being loud, and it's not about holding positions, and it's not about making ourselves feel better to have wisdom. In the early church, just like today, some people were seen as wise, but they were really just trying to platform their pride. And I think what's hard to hear is that Jesus didn't hang out with the conventionally wise of his own time. Jesus hung out with those who were hungry to know more about him and who were hungry to listen. And if we're honest, we see this same story play out in our churches today. It's so easy to see envy, selfishness, ambition, anger, and condemnation of everyone else's faults but my own within the life of the church. I was on the phone with my parents last night, and we even were talking about how hard it is to find good examples of this in the church today, because we are so often drawn to doing what I want to do, having other people see my perspective, and having other people understand things the way that I understand them. And it's absolutely hard for each and every single one of us to say, I want God's wisdom to guide every conversation that I have. And so James turns the conversation then to the fact that there is godly wisdom. And if you remember back in chapter 1 of James, he tells us that we can ask for godly wisdom if we don't have it. And so if you want wisdom, all you have to do is ask. But in verse 17, we find, the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. And in verse 17, we find out that James starts talking about this wisdom that comes from heaven. This type of wisdom would be so absolutely countercultural that if anyone dared to step outside of the walls of the church and say that they had wisdom and only showed it with their life instead of with their really loud words, they might be laughed off the street. This was so absolutely strange that James would tell the church that if you want to be seen as somebody with wisdom, go out and show it with your life. And also, by the way, be submissive and be quiet and care for other people and meet other people's needs. This is absolutely craziness that James shares with the church. But he's asking them to push back against a culture that cares only for themselves. And he's asking the church to live differently in wisdom that looks just like Jesus. He's asking the church to follow Jesus. And I love talking about culture shifts within the church because I think we are so often guided by the culture and in ways that we don't even realize it. I want you to think about like the last time that you bought a water bottle, because you probably didn't need another water bottle in your life, but maybe you saw like an advertisement a little while ago or a commercial, and it convinced you that you needed to buy this new water bottle, and so the last time you walked through Target, without even thinking about it, you were like, I need this new kind of water bottle. Or maybe you just follow trends because they're fun, instead of if it fits your actual needs of your life, like a new diet or things like that. We are so often guided by the things that we see around in the world and not necessarily intentionally choosing the steps that we take. But James is telling his hearers that wisdom, godly wisdom, cannot just be what we hear and see around us. Godly wisdom has to be given to us by the Spirit of God, and it's a different way that will shape the culture around you. Jesus is calling you to live a little bit more intentionally. And I know it's probably not exciting or flashy to think that you might go to work and have self-control or kindness or humility in the ways that you interact with people. James is not calling the church to live an easy life, but he is asking them, where can you make small changes to have more godly wisdom in your life? Because you cannot be double-minded. Wisdom does not react to conversations as much as it loves other people. I've always been guided in a lot of what I do and the way that I minister by some of the research that comes out of Fuller Seminary. And so they put out a book recently that talks about leading through change. And in this book, there's a whole section on how they believe that listening is a superpower. And they go through, like, it's not as flashy as being able to fly, and it's not as cool as being able to shrink things with your eyes. But listening is actually a truly underrated superpower. That we can care for one another in communities by being wise and listening before we speak. And I think this is exactly what James is asking us to do as the church. To not react to every moment that makes us feel an emotional response, but to love people and to listen first. Fuller talks about having these information bubbles, that if we never intentionally listen to people different than us, then we actually just find ourselves in bubbles of people that will repeat back to us what we actually are thinking, because we only hang out with people that think just like us. But most of us listen only enough to reply and not to understand. And they said, we need to get better as a church to listen, to understand the people around us, to listen for the issue beneath the issue with mercy and with grace. And I have a story to tell you because I don't always do this great. When I was 21 years old, I was a minister in North Carolina. And when I was there, I also held a position on our district. So it meant that I was in charge of youth ministry across churches across the whole state of North Carolina. And while I was there was some conflict with people. It was not always the easiest to get people from across the state to come together and plan youth events and agree on everything. And so we were putting some policies in place and changing some things. And there were people that did not like those changes. And so, try as I did, I could not find a place of unity with some of these people. And it was hard. I was so frustrated. I was so beyond myself. And then I had a friend come in. And she had grown up on the district. She cared for all of the people there. And she had a lot of wisdom in the ways that she had seen good things happen on that district before. But she also was a school teacher in the local public schools, and she saw how fast youth culture was changing and how fast we needed to move to be able to reach the students across the district. And in godly wisdom, she cared for all of us. She cared for both sides. She prayed for us. She brought unity together. And so someone inspired by the wisdom of God can be a binding force in the Christian community. We need people who go out of their way to be peacemakers. And actually, we find out that this is the blessing of the passage that we read, that those who are peacemakers bring about righteousness. And in Matthew 5:9, we hear from Jesus himself and the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." And so there is blessing in choosing to make peace. There's a promise in choosing to make peace, with righteousness as a result. And church, it is really hard to be people who are peacemakers, but God says this is the way of Jesus. Peacemakers actively sow peace even when it's messy, and a peacekeeper avoids conflict at any cost. But a life shaped like Jesus will look a lot like a peacemaker. And it doesn't mean that we don't walk into conflict sometimes, but it means that we choose our battles based on what Jesus would say and not what we would say. A life shaped like Jesus will look a lot like Jesus. And it's shown in good works and humility that sound a lot like purity in our motives, peace in our relationships, mercy in our responses, and sincerity in our leadership. But each and every single one of us has a question to answer this morning. And I asked you this question at the very beginning, and I think it still stands true right now. What small spark might you be carrying right now? Because we all have the opportunity to start a fire with a small spark at any moment. And you probably have maybe a good reason to start one right now. But how can you be handling that spark? With godly wisdom, not with earthly wisdom. James is asking us to be the kind of community that doesn't just believe in the gospel, but it lives it out. And it shares it in hospitality and kindness. James invites us to imagine a church where the loudest voices aren't the ones with power, but the wise choose to live with patience, where when we disagree with one another, we can still eat together, we can still pray together, and we can still care for one another. And so earlier, we heard about what fire can do, about how it can burn things down, and in just a moment, we can let the spark that we've been carrying go all the way through the community. It takes almost no skill to burn something down. But James leaves us with the fact that there is another way in this passage. Peacemakers can sow in peace and reap a harvest of righteousness. And this is something that we absolutely need the Spirit of God to do. Because if you like to plant plants, you know that it takes a long time sometimes to be able to see the fruit of planting something. And so James is asking us as the church to do the hard work of continuing in relationship with one another, the slow, deliberate, and patient work of having wisdom in our conversations and care for our neighbor. And we have to trust in God that something beautiful will come of it. And so this week, as you walk into your relationships, will you be carrying a match and a spark, or are you joining with Jesus in planting a seed?